Hello, I'm Lauren Henry, Executive Director of U Chicago Alumni and a proud alumna of the college. I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's virtual Harper Lecture program, When Unprecedented Becomes the Precedent, the 2024 U.S. presidential election. As many of you know, the Harper Lecture Series brings together the University of Chicago community to learn, engage, and connect on critical topics facing the world. These discussions go beyond the headlines and provide an opportunity for you to ask hard questions, engage in dialogue, and pursue a deeper understanding of the world. With that in mind, we will open the conversation to audience questions at the conclusion of the panel today. You'll be able to pose your questions via the Q&A portal at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time. We did receive more than 100 questions from all of you through the registration form, and we're really excited to address those and more throughout our time together. Joining us for this timely conversation exploring how this presidential cycle could transform American politics and policymaking for years to come are Ruth Bloch-Rubin, an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. Professor Bloch-Rubin's work focuses on legislative institutions, political parties, and American political development. John Mark Hansen, the Charles L. Hutchinson Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Political Science. Professor Hansen's scholarship and teaching focuses on elections, public opinion, and congressional politics. And William Howell, the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics and the Director of the Center for Effective Government. Professor Howell has written widely on separation of powers issues and American political institutions, especially the presidency. And leading today's conversation is Sadia Sendhu, the Executive Director of the Center for Effective Government. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And Sadia, it's my pleasure to turn the virtual stage over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. And I'll invite the other panelists to join me. Wonderful. It's so good to see you all. And I know we have a lot of excited folk on this call today. I'm going to cut right into the questions because there's a lot to cover in this unprecedented election cycle. So with that in mind, Ruth, I'd like to start off with you. In the last few weeks, both candidates have selected their running mates. What does the selection of both Tim Walz and J.D. Vance say about their respective political parties at this moment?
So I think there's a couple things to think about here. So traditionally, when we think about the selection of a VP, there's a variety of calculations a candidate might keep in mind. So for instance, maybe you're trying to nail down a part of your party coalition that you see as a weaker connection for you, or maybe you're going to use this as an opportunity to double down on a constituency that you see as particularly important. There's also a view to sort of what's the next generation of leadership going to look like and how comfortable are you weighing in on that? And so I think when we look at Vance and Walz, we see all of those issues at play. So for Harris, selecting Walz, who represents a very different kind of constituency historically than she has had a different legislative voting record. That's a part of the Democratic Party that the Harris campaign is eager to lock down. Likewise for Trump, you might say that Vance is an opportunity to double down on some of the supporters that have been most vigorously in support of the previous Trump campaigns. But it's interesting too, because Trump here has selected a much younger running mate than he did in his previous elections. And so perhaps this is an opportunity to shape the Democratic Party in the image that Trump has done so far.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ruth. Will, you were quoted in an article earlier this week in The Guardian that spoke to the charisma of Tim Walz. I'm curious, what is your take on these two selections? And specifically speaking to charisma, why does it matter in this particular election?
Oh, well, sitting right behind the question. First of all, it's great to be here and to see you all. And we're going to try to make sense of this this tumultuous time collectively. The selection of these two candidates, I'm really struck, if I could pivot slightly, I'm really struck by the selection of Vance in particular, that usually when we think about this, as Ruth pointed out, when we think about the selection of a VP, it's about speaking to other parts of a reasonably broad coalition and trying to bring in states that you wouldn't otherwise win, or offer voice to constituents that aren't feeling adequately represented by the person at the top of the ticket. And with Vance, you see squarely a doubling down. I mean, just it's as close to a facsimile as you can get of Trump. And that's really striking. It's somebody who's exactly half his age and otherwise is willing to sort of walk in lockstep with the person at the top of the ticket. In terms of charisma and the role of charisma. There are big questions about the role of campaigns generally, which I hope we're going to get to. I'll say they're traditionally VPs play the role of attack dog. They play the role of the person who's going to be a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more outspoken. It's hard to see how you get more aggressive, more outspoken than Trump at the top of the ticket there. But I think when you're trying on the Democratic side, as Kamala Harris is having to manage as the first woman at the top of the ticket and the first woman of color at the top of the ticket, these racial and gender dynamics are going to play out in interesting and important ways. And I think we can expect Walz to play the role of more kind of offering the sharpest critiques of the opposition in the weeks and months ahead.
Mark, I'm going to turn to you. We also got a question from one of your former students that I've baked into this question itself. Why do VP picks matter? Do they translate to electoral wins? There's a question around that.
Well, this was clearly someone who took my class. The empirical evidence indicates that vice presidential picks only matter in their home states. So they might help you pick up a few more votes in home states and help you to win their home states. And in this particular case, it's quite likely that the Democrats will win in Minnesota already, even without Tim Walz. And it's overwhelmingly likely, I would say, that the Republicans will win in Ohio without Senator Vance. So to the degree that there's a kind of political calculation involved in this, it's some notion of trying to appeal to people in the kind of Great Lakes Midwest area, the kind of Rust Belt states that have been the important swing states, the three Democratic blue wall states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. But of course, neither candidate picked a running mate from any of those particular states, just someone they thought might be able to help in adjoining states. The other thing I wanted to discuss, given that Will brought up Vance and the way that Trump sort of went with a carbon copy of himself with Vance, I think the other thing that's interesting about it is that in 2016, Trump felt compelled to pick someone who could help him with the constituency he was otherwise going to have a hard time getting, who were evangelical Christians. And Pence did that job for him so well that he didn't feel the need to do that in 2020. Right now, it's Trump's party. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of Donald Trump. And so he didn't feel constrained at all about any kind of internal party dynamics in making that choice.
That's super helpful and takes me right to the next question that I had, which I'm going to direct to you as well, Mark. We started to talk about the candidates and their running mates, but I'm curious if we were to zoom out, how do campaigns matter in American politics?
Well, that's another question we go through quite a lot in my class. So I've given Harper lectures before where I talk about a fundamentalist perspective on elections, which is basically identifying a set of kind of contextual conditions that seem to shape the outcomes in major ways year after year after year. And we have a lot of empirical evidence behind this. So there are things like party balance in the electorate, the state of the economy, whether the United States is at war or at peace, the positioning of the two candidates on issues in a kind of ideological space, and incumbency. Those are sort of the major ones. And behind that is also presidential performance, which in many ways, kind of presidential approval, which in many ways kind of summarizes the voters' views of all those different aspects of the conditions. And so the campaigns themselves make a difference, but they make a difference around the edges. That those kind of contextual factors will tend to bring you within pretty much the margin of error in a poll of 1,000. So, 3 percentage points or something like that, 3.5 percentage points. What we've seen lately is that those 3.5 percentage points are where all the action is. We haven't really had a blowout election since 1988. So the campaigns will matter. and the events in the campaigns will matter because they'll matter in that final couple of percentage points. That's going to be the difference between winning and losing this time around. But in terms of the fundamentals, if there's anything unusual about this year relative to the fundamentals, it's that the Democrats are as competitive as they are in this election year. So in terms of the economy, there's been a lot of talk in the press, certainly, about how voters are very, very concerned about the economy and people kind of scratching their heads about it. But it turns out that if you look at the economic indicator that is most predictive of vote outcomes, which is personal disposable income per capita, this year's personal disposable income per capita growth so far is pretty anemic. And so, it's a drag on the Democratic ticket. And likewise, President Biden's current approval rating is 36%. Donald Trump's approval rating, these are at different time points, but Donald Trump's approval rating on the eve of the election in 2020 was 41%. So, the Democrats are basically running with an unpopular incumbent and running with an economy that they would wish is a lot better than what it is, and still are competitive, which I think speaks especially to how important partisan identification and the balance of party ID in the electorate has become, that, there are just more people who will never vote for a Republican, no matter who he is, and certainly not for Donald Trump. And that's really sustaining things. And then there are questions as well about, does a particular candidate or candidate personality matter? Well, this would suggest that, maybe Donald Trump actually is not the best candidate to be leading the Republican Party at this time. That there would be other candidates, more traditional candidates, who would have been stronger.
Go ahead, Will. It looks like you want to jump in.
I want to throw in a couple of things. I mean, I think Mark did a fantastic job of characterizing how fundamentals play such a crucial role in shaping elections, and just do a remarkable job of predicting the final vote. We spend campaigns with each 24-hour news cycle obsessing about the latest event and trying to figure out how is it going to break one way or another, and yet routinely, reliably, these fundamentals do a terrific job of predicting what the final vote is. Still, it's not hard to imagine how a campaign could make an awful error that could be devastating. They could do something that would be catastrophic. And so to say that campaigns matter at the margins, and they matter at the margins with the historical record that we're having, isn't to say that should things go south horribly on one particular campaign, they might bear outside of the 3 percentage point marker. And I'm keen, Mark, I want to hear your thoughts about what you think the significance of Biden stepping down and Harris taking over, because I think there's a lot of reason to believe that as part of a Democratic Party campaign probably mattered a bunch, and that Biden was on the fast track to losing, and now it's neck and neck, and that particular event doesn't feel like a regular snafu or a good rally which is the kind of thing that we're accustomed to seeing as bearing on the direction of a campaign.
Well, I think that's right. It's pretty clearly reset the campaign, and in a way that's been very favorable for the Democrats. About a month ago, I was in Politico writing that Biden should step aside and get a new candidate, in part to reset the campaign. So in that respect, the candidate matters. What's interesting is that usually you don't want to give up incumbency. Incumbency is very, very powerful in all elections in the United States. And so the Democrats have actually switched out an incumbent for a non-incumbent. And it's clear that, the powers of incumbency are specific to a particular person, and not and don't really transfer necessarily to another nominee from the party. But in doing that, what they've done is I think that there were certainly some drags on the Biden candidacy among Democrats, and importantly among independents who might lean toward the Democrats or might be open to supporting the Democrats. And I think that that's really what's been unloosed by the new candidacy. So the vice president, I think, is just less associated with some things that have been unpopular about Biden, and controversial within the party about Biden, particularly the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in Gaza. I would cite as one of those. And the other is that by making the change, there were clearly lots and lots of voters who've been telling us for more than a year that they were concerned about President Biden's ability to run an effective campaign and to be an effective president in a second term. And so in one swoop, the Democrats managed to take that issue off the table, so that the campaign can actually talk about something else that it wants to talk about, and neatly to turn Donald Trump in the oldest man ever nominated by a major party for president.
Moving on from that too, I am curious, yesterday we had a Trump press conference in which he agreed to have a presidential debate with Vice President Kamala Harris. What are you expecting from that debate? Why don't we start with you, Ruth? Are there things that you would be looking out for? And I'm curious, both Mark and Will, has there ever been a presidential election where there was no debate? Because we were at a point up until yesterday where it seemed like there might not have been one.
I think it's an interesting question. It's hard to know what you should be looking out for in a debate where Trump is involved. I suppose for me, one of the things that's interesting is to think about how Harris has evolved as a candidate. For those of you who can remember all the way back to when she was running for president in that very crowded primary, in the debate, she came off as pretty stiff. And I think the impression was she's not a great candidate. And yet we've seen that, having been vice president and the remarkable transformation she's been able to pull off with this recent campaign, that, turns out she's actually like very friendly and chummy and delightful and has charisma of her own. And so to sort of see whether she's able to bring that out in a sort of forum where she struggled, I think will be really interesting. In part because it does seem like one of the things that the Democrats are really trying to do with this sort of new subtle campaign message, or not so subtle campaign message, about how Republicans are weird and Democrats are kind of normal people who like cats and children and not having children and things like this, right? That, she is one of us. And I think that is a very potent message, particularly if the comparator is Donald Trump, who, if you've had the opportunity to read interviews with him, sounds sort of odd, to say the least, right? And so if you can drive that wedge, I think that's a particularly useful forum for the debate, discussions about policy aside.
Mark, have we had a presidential election where there was no debate since we've had televised debates?
Well, I was going to say that it used to be that all of the presidential elections were contested without debates. Even to the extent where until 1860, there was not a single nominee who actually campaigned for the office. They let their surrogates campaign for the office. Stephen A. Douglas was the first one to actually campaign for the office. But it remained the tradition for years and years that the nominees didn't campaign at all. Actually, the era of televised presidential debates began here in Chicago in 1960. With the debate between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon at the BBM studios on McClurg Court. Here's where it all began. And since that time, there have been televised debates. They've varied in number and they've varied in terms of their timing, but there have been televised debates ever since. And the big debate has been over whether third-party candidates or independent candidates would be included in those debates or not.
Will, to your mind, are these debates significant? Why should we be paying attention to presidential debates?
So they can be significant in different ways. I actually don't think there's much evidence that they matter a whole lot for the final vote share. That's not where the action is. The idea that, who is anointed a winner or a loser in one debate or another is going to determine the outcome is is neither here nor there, for the most part. You can imagine, unless you're Joe Biden and you're doing a debate in June. And then all bets are off. But I'm a fan of debates, in not just the performative quality to them. And if you're on the Democratic side and you want to see, Kamala Harris prosecute the case and take, Trump down, it's not so much that, it's that we have fleeting opportunities as a public to see and engage presidential candidates in ways that are extemporaneous, in ways that they are pushed by each other and hopefully by an adept moderator. So much of what these campaigns are about are staged events. This is what the conventions are. They're just big, they're balloon drops over and over and over again. And speeches that are given on platforms where everything is scripted and the audience is handpicked. Debates are a little bit different, and that's good for our politics, I'd say. It's a chance to learn something about them and to hopefully hear a bit more about policy details than we're accustomed to otherwise hearing. It's good for our politics.
And you started gesturing towards the convention, which is exactly where I wanted to go next. So Mark, turning to the DNC, which is upcoming here in Chicago, I wonder if you could just say a few words about the significance of conventions, but specifically about having the DNC in Chicago and what you're looking out for, what you're expecting, and how this might differ from historical conventions we've hosted here.
So the era of real things happening at conventions was from the very first nominating conventions, which were in advance of the 1832 presidential elections, where Andrew Jackson was selected by the Democrats and Henry Clay by the Whig Party, which at the time was known as the National Republicans. And that era ended in 1968 with the Democratic Convention here in Chicago, where Hubert Humphrey, having not entered and not won a single primary, there were 13 primaries that year, became the nominee. And that was deemed so unacceptable out of that convention that the Democratic National Committee appointed a commission to reform the nomination process, which essentially made the primaries more widespread and made the primaries decisive, much more decisive in the choice of the nominee. So since that time, as Will said, it's been an entertainment more than anything else. It's balloon drops, it's infomercials. It's basically the party getting itself excited about the nominee and getting itself excited about the campaign, and the nominees and the party trying out the different messages that they want to get across to the electorate over the coming campaigns. So that's what I would expect to see here. We've already actually had the nomination vote. It happened last week, and it was electronic. This was because Ohio, dominated by Republicans, of course, had decided that it would, just to be perverse, that it would move up the deadline for when you had to have your nominees selected so that they could print them on the ballot 90 days from now. So there is no suspense about who is actually going to be the nominees. There may be a little suspense about whether Kamala Harris gets the entire vote, or whether Tim Walz gets the entire vote, or some fraction of people will say no. I'm not expecting there to be a large number who say no. And there will be some, perhaps some discussion about the things that go into the platform. But by and large, it's a celebration. It's a celebration and really a kind of preparation, kind of psychological preparation for the parties for the fall campaign.
And leading up to, you've now mentioned the nomination vote was confirmed last week. In this case, Will, this is a very unconventional selection of a candidate. I'm wondering if you could say a few words about Vice President Harris's selection and what that means for trust in this process and how people are thinking about it, how you're thinking about it.
Well, for about 6 minutes after Biden stepped down, I thought, we're going to have a brokered convention. How interesting. And what a terrific opportunity for the Democratic Party to take a beat and lift up its talent, and hold a set of events around the country where they could share their views about the direction of the party, the direction of the country, um, and that was for naught, because in no time at all, everybody fell right in line behind Harris. And there are reasons for eventually picking her, powerful reasons for eventually deciding to go with her. To my mind, it was a missed opportunity, because it would have been good for the party to fix the national attention and control the news cycle around this really compelling plot line about what are the Democrats going to do. They've shifted gears insofar as now we've had some of that with regard to the VP pick. And what I'm struck is that all the frontrunners have behaved incredibly well. No, there's been no sniping, there's been no backstabbing, there's been no elbowing. And one of the arguments for why it was important to quickly fall in line behind Harris is because this would open up all kinds of cleavages and tear the party asunder. And to my mind, there's no evidence of that whatsoever, that in fact, all the way through the party, even as they've effectively picked two centrists, and the far left wing has very little voice in these two folk. There's no Elizabeth Warren here. There's no Bernie Sanders here on offer. And even as there's lots of discontent within the party about a number of issues, Mark earlier mentioned the war in Gaza, for sure, and there are others as well. Nonetheless, people have behaved incredibly well in the sense that there's been lots of harmony. And to my mind, if we could go back in time, rest assured, people on the left of the political spectrum want to beat Trump. You can take a moment to lift up your talent and reflect on it. Things won't all fall apart. They didn't do that. And we are where we are, which is a whole lot of excitement right now around Harris, and now around the VP selection. It'll be interesting to see how much that carries forward, because to my mind, that excitement was there to be had. The question is, how much would you build up with it, and how long would it last?
I'm curious, Ruth, for your thoughts on this. We're talking about this moment in time in the Democratic Party. Are there conclusions that you think we can draw more broadly about the future of the Democratic Party based on what one can call perhaps a good behavior and the rallying around a candidate quickly and seemingly, without much issue? What are you looking at?
Well, I'll just backtrack to say I'm less sanguine than Will is that this would have all played out as nicely had Democrats not rallied around Harris, in part because I think it would have raised important and very difficult questions within the party about what they want to prioritize. Obviously, her candidacy represents an important segment of Democratic voters, Black women, reproductive rights. And this goes back to a comment Mark made. One virtue of having a new candidate for the Democratic ticket is it allows you to reset the campaign and talk about different issues. Reproductive rights is an incredibly popular issue for Democrats to be talking about, and you can make inroads among Republican women, as we've seen anti-abortion legislation or pro-abortion legislation failing in red states. And so this suggests, right, that this is a live issue for a lot of people. And so I think I'm not so sure that things would have played out nicely here. I think with the VP pick, because it's, as folks have said, a lower stakes discussion, we can see people's ambitions play out within sort of a safe space. I think probably picking a presidential candidate is a lot like legislating, which is you don't want to see the sausage get made, and a seamless transition is maybe a better way to go on a short time frame. Although I don't disagree with Will that from a small d Democratic perspective, getting to have all of these ideas and positions that different candidates may have air out is important. But if your primary outcome is to beat the Republican candidate for president, then it's sort of hard to think that this is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, thinking about where we take this, I guess the fact that this is a sort of contrived nomination at some level leads one to want to be cautious about what that means for Democratic Party politics and coalitional politics going forward. By picking Harris quickly, we didn't see a lot of those underlying factional cleavages break out. That doesn't mean they're not there. And in fact, I think were Democrats to win a majority in the House, we would see those present. And so I think it's important not to sort of overestimate what we see from the Democratic Party. But it is really an achievement for the Harris campaign to have pulled off a seamless control over the Democratic Party, and speaks to, I think, at a time when we're questioning whether the Democratic Party is, as some have argued, hollow without sort of this organizational infrastructure or guts. I think pretty good evidence that, you know, the party can come together and organize when it wants. And this is a pretty good reason to.
And we started to talk about one of the things that was very unprecedented about this election, which was selection process for Vice President Kamala Harris. But there's been other things as well, you know, for everything from third-party candidates to an assassination attempt, felony convictions. I've got a whole list here. The movement around an uncommitted vote. There's just a lot going on. And I'm curious how this differs in our democracy from previous moments in the US. And if there's something unique about what's happening here versus what we've seen in other elections around the world this year, given the number of historical elections that have happened in major democracies. And that's a question for all three of you. So whoever wants to jump in first can take that. Please,
Well, I'll start. You know, we are subject in our democracy to many of the same forces that other democracies are subject to, and we always have been. You know, the 1932 election here in the United States went one way and went different ways in other places. Incumbent parties got thrown out in both places, and they were replaced by whoever wasn't the incumbent party. And that's kind of what we've seen so far in Britain, especially. You know, France a little more ambiguously, but there was certainly some anti-incumbent feeling that was at work in France. And yeah, that's a real question for us this fall, is sort of how much of this is kind of generalized dissatisfaction just with overall conditions and that get blamed on the incumbent and on the incumbent's party. You know, in terms of how this moment compares to previous moments, I've been talking a lot about Chicago's conventions, and the comparison that always people want to know about is, you know, this year versus 1968. And I don't think there's even close to a comparison. 1968 was just enormously different from the current moment. There was an assassination attempt this year. There were actually two assassinations in 1968. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in April and Robert Kennedy after winning the California primary in June. There were riots in American cities after the assassination of Dr. King. There were riots in American cities in the years preceding 1968. There was a third-party candidate, George Wallace, who was running essentially to reverse all the gains of the civil rights movement and to escalate the war in Vietnam. And you had an enormously popular, I would say, in terms of its breadth. You had an enormously popular movement against the war in Vietnam, led by young people, but not exclusively young people. And all of that was concentrated in such a way as to create divisions, particularly within the Democratic Party. And while we have deep divisions this year, those divisions are primarily between the political parties, much more so than within the political parties.
I'll add to that. And boy, Mayor Daley looks awfully different from Mayor Johnson. If you want to think about what a police response or the local government response will be to the protests that we can expect, such as they exist here in the convention that's coming up. I'll add a couple things too. You asked about the kind of global context. And Mark earlier pointed out that the party of the Republican Party is the party of Trump, which is decidedly true. And Trump is a populist. What we've seen is populism taking over a singular party. And if you want to understand the roots of populism, it's really helpful to think about it in global terms. This is not unique to the United States. There are populist parties around the globe, and the fortunes of populist parties are abroad are tied to the fortunes here, which has to do with a sense of grievance, a sense of dislocation, concerns about population movements, about globalization and the ways that it has strained communities and families, a sense of precarity. These are the sensibilities, the vulnerabilities that populists globally put to use as they try to ascend power. It's decidedly what Trump has done, and it's what populist parties have done around the globe. And so that for sure puts us into conversation with not with global trends in ways that I think we would do well in trying to make sense of this moment, in trying to make sense of Trump too. I think so often we're inclined to say, and there's talk about this now, the Trump fever will pass. It's because the notion is it's all about Trump, the individual who single-handedly, stormed the castle gates and took hold. And that misconstrues things profoundly, in my view, because he's tapping into structural forces, trends that play out. They played out for a long time in the United States. They play out around the globe.
I would just add that not only can we look and learn from what's happening in a global context, but we can look and learn back to American history. There have been populist parties in the past. And so just as we can understand that different party movements have their own tenor, there was a populist party within the United States in the 1910s and 1920s, and that the populist democratic fever did eventually break. So maybe we can learn some important lessons about the kind of conditions that might lead to that and whether they obtain now. To Will's point, I agree. I think the idea that this is Trump-based seems wrong, although he's a very effective vehicle for it. But if we want to understand whether, this sort of populist tendency within the Republican Party is likely to be eroding anytime soon, we want to look back at how those sort of partisan movements have petered out in the past.
And I know, Ruth, both you and Will have books that are coming out in the next couple of months or the next year. I'm curious if you had to rewrite a chapter in either of those books, given what we've seen in the last couple of months. Ruth, yours is about political parties. Will, yours is about the conservative movement and all sorts of changes in our democracy as it relates to the rise of populism. Is there something that's happening in this election that would cause you to rewrite a chapter, or something that you wish you could write post-election?
Well, I'm going to get to this before Will can. I'm going to take a page out of Will's book and double down on a position, which is that if you want to understand the weakness of Speaker Johnson, and I think if Republicans hold on to their House majority, we're just going to see a lot more of that. It comes from having counterintuitively a party where there isn't a lot of organized dissension, but rather one faction within the party that is quite strong and very capable at a sort of collective action level, and then a group of moderates who still remain within the House majority, but who are disorganized and unwilling to work together. And that means that Speaker Johnson's is in this unfortunate situation where whenever he needs to negotiate, he's going to negotiate with the best organized partner within the Republican coalition, and that's the far right. And so if we're thinking about what kind of policy the Republican majority, should they keep their majority? Should we get, I think we're going to see it moving farther to the right, although a Democratic president would perhaps alter some of that, although it hasn't so far, and that we won't see him sort of ascend to the level of leadership competency that we've seen on the Democratic side.
The book that I've written with Terry Moe is a book that traces the rise of presidential power in ways that are acutely alarming and a threat to democracy, the rise of unilateral powers that presidents can wield. And it is tied to the growth of the administrative state. And in important ways, it has a partisan inflection in that the long-standing conservative reaction to the administrative state has led the Republican Party to make unbelievable claims on behalf of a vastly more powerful president, so much so that we see it as being a distinct threat to democracy. This is a story that plays out over decades, and it's a story that's going to play out for the years ahead. And so you said, is there a chapter we're going to need to rewrite? I think, and in the spirit of doubling down, if Trump loses, and he may lose, What we would say is that we're not free and clear, that those threats are going to persist, both because the arguments on behalf of and the work on behalf of building a vastly more powerful president in the domain of unilateral power and in the oversight and the exercise of control and the efforts to sabotage the administrative state has played out. There's a long back history for that. And the structural conditions that are now in place to see it carry forward well past this election. So we're not going to be free and clear. So the answer is we won't have to rewrite anything in the aftermath of this election. It doesn't hinge on it breaking one way or another. This is really a story of us needing to buckle up and get serious about how we attend to our democracy. A lot rides, obviously, in who wins this upcoming election, but very little will be resolved once and for all.
Mark, I've given both Ruth and Will an opportunity to double down on a position. So I'm curious if there's something that you would like to double down on as we wrap up this part of the conversation.
Well, I'm about to kick off my presidential elections course in the fall. And going into it, I have been, I take this particular approach, which is that the campaigns don't matter a whole lot. And that what you really need to do to understand elections is to understand sort of where the fundamentals come from and why they're important in the choices that voters make in elections. And as all of these new things came up, as all of these unprecedented things came up, I began to think, well, do I need to adjust my course? And I've decided I'm going to go straight ahead and teach it the way I always do. And we'll treat it as a test of the perspective I've been taking since 2004 in the class.
That's wonderful. I wish I could shadow your class. Will, I also would like to shadow your class in the fall as well. We're going to turn to audience questions. So the first one comes from Jonathan, who is a Harris grad from 2012. Jonathan asks, our country is so polarized today that it is often surprising and disappointing when new information of any magnitude doesn't seem to shift polls or voting behavior. What do you think, if anything, can cut through this partisan polarization? Is it likely that anything can cause a large shift beyond the margins? Are landslides a thing of the past? It's not directed to any one person. Will, go ahead, please.
Well, there are two things that are in play here. There's the polarization, and then there's how evenly balanced we are as a country. So the landslide point is a point about whether or not one party or one constituency has a decisive advantage. And the answer for the most part is no. There are certain institutional arrangements like the Electoral College, like the Senate, that decidedly benefit the Republican Party, but we are roughly evenly divided as a country. And so landslides, not so much. I just want to make one point when we think about polarization. It's a basic point, but it's one that we often lose sight of, is that the polarization, there's a tremendous amount of evidence of polarization reaching historic highs today and having increased steadily over the last 50 years at the elite level. When you look at elected officials, there's all kinds of evidence that Democrats are far more liberal and Republicans are far more conservative than they once were. The evidence is not so great when you look at average voters, that in fact, there's quite a bit that points to the polarization that we see at the elite level, not at all mirroring or representing equivalent trends among the mass electorate. And so an ongoing question for political scientists, I think that they're puzzling over, is how can that be? Like, what sustains these ongoing, and some would argue pernicious, trends of elite level polarization, if it isn't prior shifts in the views of average voters that are driving it. And there's a tremendous amount of research being done on that. But so I wanted to make that one distinction.
Well, I would say at the level of voters, I think Will's right. There is a greater mystery about what's going on with voters than there is among elites. But what we have also seen, though, which gives the appearance at least of polarization, is that with the realignment of the political parties, sort of social realignment of political parties relative to voters, that began with Ronald Reagan and really kind of worked itself out by the 1990s when the Republicans finally won the Congress again, the House again for the first time in a very, very long time. What's happened is that there seems to be a sort of primary cleavage in the electorate that is not cross-cut by some other cleavage in the electorate. Where before, after the Civil War, there was a north-south cleavage in the electorate that was overlaid by the kind of economic cleavage that we've seen for a long time. And in the New Deal period, a kind of cleavage around racial issues that was overlaid onto the cleavage on economic issues. And those now are just much more in sync with each other. With the result that, states that for a long, long time had been thought to be, diehard Republican states, places like Vermont, are now considered to be sort of core Democratic states, and places like Georgia, which was considered to be part of the Solid South, are seen as key Republican states. I wish I knew how to kind of solve this problem, and I'm afraid I don't. If I did, I would probably be nominating myself for a Peace Prize or something, because I do think it's one of the key challenges for our democracy right now, and I wish I had an answer to it.
Ruth, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I would just say that I take Will's point that it's worth focusing on both sort of the extent to which we could have landslide elections and then polarization as a separate thing. I think at the elite level, there's pretty good evidence and I think good theoretical reasons to think they're connected. And so if you think about Congress here, the fact that we are closely divided means that in any given midterm election or presidential election, there's a promise that the majority would flip. And so this creates pernicious incentives for both parties to try and appear more different for voters and to sort of make the other side look bad. And so if we think about what's happening in Congress, the fact that it's not clear whether Republicans are going to be able to keep their House majority means that both Democrats and Republicans have an incentive to structure votes, to talk about policy, to demean each other in ways that make it seem like we all hate each other. But as I think, Will suggested, right, at the grassroots, it's less apparent that deep division really exists. And I think if we go back to some original questions we talked about, like why pick these VPs, it's an opportunity to see, are those constituencies that say Waltz is, I think, ideally a good test case to see whether he can bring some of those people back into the fold, right? That could happen at the grassroots level, but as long as Congress is closely divided, I think it'll remain deeply divided.
Another thing I would say about polarization that I think is interesting is that even though the number of people who say that they're independents has been rising, the number who stay independents once you ask them whether they lean one way or another has been declining. And over the last couple of election cycles, the Trump election cycles in 2016 and 2020, I just looked at this the other day. What really stood out to me in looking at the data is that the percentage of both Democrats and Republicans who call themselves strong Democrats, who see their commitments to the party as strong, has increased markedly just over those two election cycles. And that's especially true on the Republican side, but it's also true on the Democratic side. And so that strong identification with the party is another aspect, really, of partisan polarization. Because it's people who basically have seen it as something that is extremely important to them in a way that wasn't the case in the mid part of the 20th century.
If you look at what's called, political scientists call affective polarization trends over time therein, which is roughly a measure of, what are your feelings towards the opposite party? That polarization actually has increased markedly as well, that there is at the same time a greater adherence to party. There also is heightened levels of anger that average citizens feel about the opposition. That's true. And what makes all this confounding is that there isn't, though, clear evidence that issue by issue that the mass electorate is especially divided, or is becoming polarized. If you ask people routinely, where do you stand on the minimum wage? You're likely to get an answer that's going to be between Mitch McConnell's answer and Nancy Pelosi's answer. And so there we are. One other thing, which is interesting, Mark, you raised the idea of there being what would be a kind of cross-cutting cleavage in contemporary American politics. And I would suggest one about which there's been a little bit of work, which has to do with people's trust in, this is something you raised earlier, Sadia, trust in institutions, their faith in institutions, that there is a rising level of patent distrust, a sense that everything is broken, a sense that our democracy is corrupt through and through, that animates decidedly the populist wing of the Republican Party, but that also can find representation on the left of the political spectrum as well. And that's something, when we think about something that might roil our politics and a source of real concern, when a public loses trust in its institution and isn't especially interested in doing the hard work of reforming it, rolling up their sleeves and thinking critically and carefully about the trade-offs involved with any particular reform, but is inclined to just blow it up. That's really troubling from a small d democratic perspective, and is something that we need to keep an eye on.
One of the institutions we haven't had a lot of time on this panel to talk about just yet, but has come in as a question from an audience member. This comes from Marie, who's asking each of the speakers about their opinions on the role of the media in the election cycle, in particular in contrast to what is being presented on X and other social media outlets, very polarized views there. I'm curious, we haven't talked about the media at all. What would you all like to say about the role of the media in this election cycle? And I'll add just to go off of what Will was just talking about, what that means for trust in elections and trust in the process. Ruth, do you want to take that? Or Will, go ahead. We'll start with Ruth and then we'll come to you, Will.
I mean, I think there are a couple of things that are maybe worth flagging. One of which is that there seems to be some evidence, right? If we're thinking, connecting this to the conversation we had about polarization, that, one of the reasons people may have these sort of effective responses to people who are perceived as the other is precisely because there's a kind of siloing of media markets for people. Because we all are, the sort of conventional take is we're not all watching the same nightly news. And so the fact that we can pick the kinds of media we want to consume means that it allows us effectively as voters to double down on the views that we want and to think about our people and then the other people. And to the extent that we want to have conversations with them, if we're not all watching the same things, right? It's a lot harder to do that. That's, what we miss from primetime television, if you will. I think the other thing that's worth thinking about is, what role do journalists and media coverage have in shaping the issues and policies that we see as sort of critical to a campaign? And here I think one of the challenges journalists have is that there's a tendency to want to cover process and less discussion of policy. And so perhaps it's not surprising that, the things we're divided about may not be about policy because that's not what is being covered in the news. A lot of news outlets are talking about these sort of internal politics and individuals leaking things and backbiting. That's, if we remember what the entirety of the Trump administration was about, it was inevitably about, sniping from within and sniping from without. And so I think, it's a challenge in thinking about the role that the media can play in just sort of setting our internal agendas for what we care about.
Will, I'm going to take moderator's privilege here and add a secondary question for you, because I think this is something that our center has thought deeply about as well. Like, what is the role of media and how can one work with large media organizations in order to develop a more robust conversation for our public square?
Oh, it matters a ton. If you want to have a coherent conversation about problems of enduring significance that defy easy solutions, you do well, as we try to do in the Center for Effective Government, to enter into partnerships with media who then can not just one story at a time give a shout out to particular plot lines, but to try to shape an ongoing conversation in recognition of the many trade-offs associated with one policy intervention or one institutional reform or another. Media matters a bunch. I'll say that we're also in an era when media markets are in tumult. You see the big trends point towards the bottoming out of local news. At the same time, the emergence of new media venues, social media in particular, as a whole ecosystem, particularly on the right, driven by Fox News, and a whole lot of affiliates who exercise a distinct kind of influence, not just over their audience, but over the direction of conservative politics. And scholars are really trying to keep pace. There's evidence of silos. There's also evidence of, in their media diets, plenty of people sampling sources across the political spectrum, checking in on Fox News at the same time that they read CNBC, this kind of thing. There are marked differences in terms of levels of trust in different organizations, and yet a willingness to consult them. And I'll end with this tidbit because it's irresistible, which I learned in working with Winston Berg, who is a recent PhD student out of our department, in the political science department, we're fortunate to have around a little bit longer. He's going to be teaching this coming year. He did an ethnography of QAnon. And if you want to think about like where you would expect misinformation and odd sources and all kinds of craziness to really take hold, it would be there. And singularly, the most important news source that the people who are constructing the conspiracy plotline, conspiracy theories around QAnon are CNN and mainstream media, that they routinely are consulting mainstream sources and then putting their own spin on it and then going to wild places with it. But I think oftentimes I'm going to go out on a limb here and I'll end with this. I think we overemphasize what the nature of the diet is. And a lot of the work has to do with what work you do, what meaning you assign to the information, what trust you have in the information that comes to you.
Thank you. Shifting gears just a bit, Mark, this is a question from Scott. Some people believe that the presidential election will be decided in a few swing counties and a few swing states. Do you think that is true? If so, what will be the deciding factors for each party in trying to win those key counties?
The counties don't matter, but the states certainly do. And the reason for that, of course, is the Electoral College. We effectively, we don't have a national election. We have separate elections in 51 different constituencies, so 50 states plus the District of Columbia. And the only thing that matters is who wins each of those states and what it adds up to in the Electoral College. So it's certainly going to come down to that. What that does in terms of campaigning is that it tends to focus the campaign on issues that matter in those few states. So once again, trade is out there because that's a big issue in the Rust Belt states in particular, where there's been considerable job losses in manufacturing and where there's been considerable dislocation because of those job losses. Immigration is another, in part because of the impact of immigration on the southern border and in the southern states. Places like, Georgia and Texas and Arizona and Nevada and so forth is another aspect of that. And likewise, the issue that Ruth talked about of abortion and more broadly freedom. I think it's interesting the way that the Democratic campaign so far has made abortion not just about abortion, but about a whole range of things around personal freedom and the ability of individuals to choose for themselves. Those kinds of things have shown themselves to be very powerful in those sorts of states. So that's the way it's going to affect the campaign. It's just that, as usual, the concerns of people in Illinois and New York State and California and Texas and the other states that are never in play recently in presidential elections. Whatever those issues might be, we're not going to hear very much about them.
I've taken mostly questions from alums, so I'm going to turn to an incoming student. This is an incoming graduate student, Ryan, who'll be joining us at the Harris School. He's wondering if the panelists can speak a little to how the era of unprecedentedness plays into the distrust of electoral polling, or maybe vice versa. Obviously, we saw a huge shock amongst data and polling experts in the outcome of the 2016 election. Is there still the same level of skepticism in polls and collected data today? And if so, how do you think this will impact the future of our electoral politics? Well, you used to be on the CNN desk, so I'm curious what you think about this.
Well, I mean, polls as a reliable source of information about public opinion are, they're in trouble because people are answering their phone. I mean, it's that simple, and the people who do answer the phone are an odd lot. And so pollsters have struggled mightily to figure out what kind of technology can they use in order to build a panel, or to use convenience samples that then they weight up according to a set of demographics in order to back out estimates that reflect the broader views of a public. They're struggling, and that's not a story about this election. That's a story about the last 20 years. When we did in our home discipline, when we wrote papers where we did surveys, we do that now. 20 years ago, you routinely needed to say what your response rate was, and we've just stopped reporting that because the response rate is so miserably low. That it's no longer, there's no way to get to a place of pride in reporting that out. So I think it's generally a problem. One thing though that I'll say, because I can't resist, you pointed out I was on the decision desk in 2016. The amount of time and energy and effort that goes into predicting, and the resources into predicting final votes that are devoted on election day, all those exit polls, which have all kinds of biases weighted built into them, all that infrastructure, when it's available to us as a country, we could just go to bed, wake up the next day, and read about what the actual result is, and know who the winner is, without thinking, can I guess at 7 p.m. what we're going to know at 10 p.m. based on all this faulty polling prediction, this faulty polling infrastructure? I would make a pitch that maybe we all, have a meal with our families on election nights, reflect a bit on the day, and then just wait until the next, when we actually find out what the truth is.
Well, I'll tell you, my anxiety doesn't allow me to stay up and watch the polls. So I do in fact do that.
You go to bed.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful for me. It's wonderful for my family as well. Mark, Ruth, would you like to add anything as well?
Well, I'm a little bit more sympathetic, shall we say, to the polls. Will's right. The declining response rates have been a big problem. However, I would remind everybody that in 2016, if you looked at the poll aggregators, and in particular at 538, which got a lot of criticism, but still I sort of felt like came out pretty well. Going into election day, they had about a 2/3 chance of Hillary Clinton being elected and a 1/3 chance of Donald Trump being elected, which struck me as a pretty good assessment of where the race was on the eve of the election. To expect polls to predict something as unprecedented or as uncommon as electoral college anomaly, and how things are going to break in a few states successfully. It seemed to me that there are ways of still using polls that get you pretty far, actually, to anticipating what the results are going to be. I actually start my class on presidential elections with the very famous photograph of Harry Truman holding up the Chicago Tribune headline, "Dewey defeats Truman," which was taken actually at the St. Louis rail station because that's the only place where the papers hadn't been called back once the Tribune realized its mistake. You know, looking at what the returns are going to be, or what returns had already come in the evening, the Tribune made that call because several Eastern states had voted differently than they did in 1944, and they extrapolated for the rest of the country, and it turned out the rest of the country wasn't anywhere near what was happening in the Eastern states. So, any kind of way of trying to anticipate these, short of just waiting until the count comes in, is going to be subject to some kinds of error and bias.
Wonderful. Ruth, would you like to weigh in?
Sure, I'll weigh in on this question about unprecedented. And I think here it's worth underscoring that a lot of the events we've had are not unprecedented, they're infrequent, right? We've had assassination attempts, we've had sitting presidents decide that they're not going to run. One challenge is that the sort of data that we have available today is, I guess, not counting the conversation we've just had, better than it might have been in the 80s or 60s or in prior periods of American history. But that doesn't mean that we can't draw inferences about what might happen based on our knowledge of what did happen. But it does require that we do so differently and, sort of recognize conditions that we're obtaining then that might be here. But I think we have a lot more at our disposal to make, I wouldn't say predictions, but soft ideas about what the future might hold, right? Read the tea leaves. We're not operating from a place of total ignorance.
I think this might be our last question. It comes from Kevin. Ruth, I'm going to give it to you, and then Will and Mark, I'd love for you to also chime in. Is there any circumstance you can see where both parties would agree to reforming the Electoral College?
Well, as someone who studies Congress, where it's hard to imagine anyone agreeing on anything, given that institutional venue, I think, one of the things is maybe we're thinking about what are the conditions that might lead a bipartisan effort in support of that. And I think one thing is we tend to think that reforms of this kind happen when neither side can know for certain that they're going to be losers in the future, right? If there's sufficient uncertainty about who might gain, then there may be an ability to get people together, right? Whereas your incentive to oppose something, if you know the other side is going to be advantaged, that's likely to sort of harden the lines of opposition. And so right now, Democrats have won popular votes and lost the Electoral College more than Republicans. And so I think to the extent that there's uncertainty over who would gain from an Electoral College reform, it's harder to imagine that happening. On the other hand, Will's right that there is this sort of sense of distrust in governing institutions in both parties. And so if a reform coalition were able to tap into that and to sort of frame the Electoral College as distorting one of these institutions that distorts the public's preferences across the board, then that maybe that would be a winning pitch for both parties. But I suppose if you were to ask me, what are the odds? I'm not betting on it. But that's not to say that it wouldn't be, I think, a remarkable achievement if reformers are able to make it happen.
I've been tilting at this windmill since 2000, when I had an op-ed in the Washington Post about the Electoral College anomaly that occurred for the first time in 112 years in that year. I don't see that the possibilities for reform are very great. Like Ruth, I just don't think it's probably going to happen. It's not just the case that Republicans have benefited more often than Democrats from electoral college anomalies. Only Republicans or Whigs have benefited from electoral college anomalies, even though there's been discussion sometimes, as in 2004, where if Kerry had won in Ohio, he would have won in the Electoral College, but it just hasn't happened. So this is something that has benefited one party exclusively relative to the other party. The other piece of it is that if you sort of think about what a constitutional amendment would take, and there are other options, which is the this sort of state compact to vote your electoral votes according to the national two-party division of the vote. But if you sort of think about what all that would take, the median state, the state with the median number of electoral votes, is a small state. And to the degree that small states believe that the Electoral College helps somehow to safeguard their interest, which is something that you hear all the time, and it seems that it's probably pretty unlikely. The problem, though, is that the Electoral College does not benefit small states systematically relative to large states. It benefits states that have a close partisan division in their electorates relative to states that don't. And so, small states like the state I'm from, Kansas, the last presidential candidate to actually campaign in Kansas was Barack Obama. And that was because his uncle had grown up in Kansas, or his mother had grown up, her grandmother, I think, had grown up in Kansas, something along those lines. And before that, it was Bob Dole, who was from Kansas. So there are an awful lot of states basically that are not being well served by the Electoral College. There are 7 or 8 states that are. And so if one could turn the conversation to conversation about, well, what is going to help to bring the concerns of your state to the campaigns, I think the answer to that is quite clear, which is that getting rid of the Electoral College would be a vast gain for almost everybody in the country.
Except for the people who are selling ads in, the 3 competitive states,
in Ohio,
making a fortune, right? But I mean, I agree that you have to take like a precondition for this to become a live issue is that it not decidedly benefit one party. There's an initial one, because to the extent that it no longer reliably benefits one party, then people may think it as being inconsequential. And so there needs to be a follow-on, a recognition that it's distortionary, that small states don't stand to benefit, this sort of thing. And so that's the stuff of a broader institutional reform movement, to my mind. And institutions are slow to move. They're very sticky. But in addition to reframing how we talk about the stakes involved with the Electoral College, I would suggest we might also fold that into a larger conversation about how our democracy is on its heels and our institutions are not effectively serving the best interests of a broader public. And there have been moments in American political history where those conversations have taken hold and have been incredibly consequential. And in any given year, if you're asked to place a bet, will the reform go through? You should bet against it. And yet, if you can break through, you can really shape our politics in ways that can be profound and enduring. And so there's a lot of reason to focus on that kind of work.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Mark. I suspect, given how fast things have been moving, we might need a part 2 to this Harper Lectures, but I'll leave that up to Lauren to decide. So I want to thank our panelists for today's conversation, and I'd love to invite Lauren back.
Well, thank you so much, Sadia, and thank you, Professors Black-Rubin, Hansen, and Howell. I also want to thank our audience for your participation on this complex and timely program, and for your more than 80 questions during the event, added to the more than 100 questions that came prior to the event. It is really insightful conversations like these and just the depth of thoughtful engagement that we see the entire audience bring to these conversations that reminds me why I'm proud to be a member of this intellectual community every single day. If you want more insights from our University of Chicago scholars on this topic and more, I invite you to explore the Chicago Review via the link being shared in the chat. There you'll find articles, videos, and podcasts from across the university, including a series on elections. But most importantly, I want to thank our panel again. I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your Friday to join us. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you at the next Harper or one of our other upcoming programs. Thank you.